So a question, you touched on the media briefly. I think the media, unfortunately, is doing, whether intentionally or not, I fear a little bit intentionally, to perpetuate these kind of, stereotypes and just keep us in the current system, How have you seen the media kind of perpetuate these inequalities, just not the dialogue that we're all human, we're in this together, and I think we need more of that, and that's what we're trying to do here. But how have you seen the media, perpetuate the difficulties we're going through?
Well, the media is a reflection of our societal culture, right? And so it's really a reflection of us. And so the people in the media are just people like us. And so they're making the same mistakes any of us would make when we don't have self-awareness, consciousness around racism and what it is and how we all play a role in it and holding up that system. And so what you see in the media is literally what's happening in society. And what's important about the point you just made, that connection, is a lot of times people don't realize that the way racism thrives is this gentleman, Bonilla Silva, wrote a book called Racism Without Racists. It's the idea that once you put a system in place, it kind of becomes self-perpetuating, right? And it doesn't take conscious effort or intent to keep that system going, right? And it happens not just with things like racism, but it happens with all things. Government, right? Once you set that thing up, it becomes this like self-fueling, perpetuating thing, right? That no one seems to like actually be responsible for, right? And so that's the same thing with racism. And I think when you talk about the media, it's that, reflection of us is what we're getting back at us through the media. And it's reinforcing, and it becomes a cycle, right? And if you talk to folks in the media, they would never say that they're doing anything intentionally. They would say, "Oh no, I'm a progressive liberal, and I, yada yada yada. I voted for Barack Obama," like all the stuff that people say, right? And the idea is that they're racist with intent, right? They're racially awkward, right? They're racially ignorant, and they don't realize that there's a role that they play and that they actually have a lot of power in that role and what they're putting out into the world and the masses that they're reaching through that message. And I'll give, and for folks who are interested, there's a great report that that Race Forward did on the media, and how if you look at all of the articles that talk about anything having to do with race or racism, the gaps there are in the way the issues get framed. So there's usually no historical context, so there's no acknowledgement of the issue, like why the issue actually exists, right? We just talk about the symptoms. That there's no acknowledgement of the institutional role in things, that there's not a connection of the pattern of behavior in the way things get reported, right? They're reported as these isolated things that are one-off and are ahistorical or ahistoric.
Listening to you, and since this is our very first show, I'm getting ideas about things that, one thing I think we should do is perhaps provide a list of, you mentioned the Racism Without Racists, and other things that people who want to move forward in thinking about this. I also have a question. What would you hope that white people said to other white people about this? Because putting the burden on, that people of color have to explain this over and over again seems not the best way
We're
to
in this
move forward.
together.
We're in this together, yeah. And that's actually my goal when I'm doing my work, is to, so yes, it's exhausting, to your point earlier about kind of always having to explain to people, it's okay to come talk to me, don't be afraid of the 5'2", 100 and something pound, like little black lady, right? But that this idea, the reason why it's so important to do that as a person of color is so that there are more white people who can talk to other white people, right? And the other thing.
But what do you hope they would say?
Well, what I hope they would say is, number one, that we need to, as white people, go through our own identity, racial identity journey, right? That white people have a race too, and there's a culture associated with that race that exists and is impacting other people, and we should understand what that is, right? And that the issues that people of color are dealing with are not unique to people of color. It's worse for them because of the history of policies and practices that have led to these perverse outcomes. But ultimately, that there's a opportunity here for us to learn and grow for ourselves together so that we can partner with people of color across the issues that we're dealing with, right? So we talked about politics, we talk about substance use disorder. I mean, you can talk about the wealth gap in this country, right? It's huge for people of color, and people talk about the racial wealth gap, but we don't talk about the fact that there's just, in general, a wealth gap, rather, in this country where all of us are suffering. It's not just people of color.
Can I build on that for a second? So I think we're seeing a shift, not enough, not fast enough, but of people, white people, progressives, acknowledging that it's very important to listen, it's important to step into or bridge that experience. But there's also a way almost in which unintentionally even progressives can say, well, now we're really paying attention and we understand that people of color have unique problems and so in a way it can sort of backfire in the sense that there can't really be a conversation because now we acknowledge that there's this unique set of conditions that we do not presume to engage with. You see what I mean? It's sort of a subtle problem. So there has to be empowerment even within that progressive frame to go ahead and talk, to go ahead. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
And actually what's one thing I didn't mention earlier is, because I kind of joked about the progressive Northeast.
Yeah.
One of the things that research shows us is that the more we think we have things handled, the more confident we are in our abilities to navigate racism or to advance racial equity, the more dangerous we are. Because what it means is that you're not managing yourself. You don't feel the need to learn or grow or do anything, right? There's no humility there. We've been doing this forever, right? We were the first to fill in the blank.
Yeah.
And that's resting on history, right? And not, again, it's abdicating responsibility. And the idea is that we help people to be able to kind of get that out of their heads, right? And that there are problems today that we can address in real time. So practical stuff. So like if you work in an organization, right, and you have any kind of authority, even if you're not even a C-suite, you're like a mid-level manager, you have to hire people, you have to manage people. And the things that we need to do to address racism and advance racial equity are the things that we need to do to be better people, right? It makes you a better manager. It makes you a better parent, a better loved one, friend. And so if you're a manager, that means that you don't allow your assumptions to get in the way of the nuance of who people are, right? Allow yourself to be surprised, right? That gets to listening, to learn and not to rebut, right? Or interject, because you already know. So you're just gonna jump in there and cut it off at the legs. The other thing is that in organizations, like if you're a manager, to not see it as circles and boxes and arrows, like that's what the work is, because those things don't work if you don't have a handle on the people in the organization. If folks don't feel like they are connected to one another in an organization, it's harder for them to work together. And so being able to help build those relationships in organizations are important. And then the last thing I'll say, from a policy perspective within organizations, even how we hire people, right? Slowing down and during hiring processes, like having a clear process for how that happens that allows some space to remind ourselves that we're people, right? And I know I could make some assumptions about this person, about this candidate, and I'm gonna go into this with an open mind. I'm consciously going into this room, telling myself that I need to just listen and learn about who this person is and what their qualifications are for the position. Because what we usually do is we go in and we listen to the person and we're thinking about other stuff because we've already sized them up and we're like, okay, they don't fit our culture, which is code language. We don't realize it's coded language. It's unintentional coded language. But I don't see how they would fit into our organization. Or we have someone sitting in front of us and we just like them. oh, I think they'd be really good here. I just really like them, and usually underlying that it's, oh, they reminded me of myself when I was that age. Or it's, oh, they know someone that I know, and so I feel extra connected to them. Or, they came through a recommendation from someone maybe I don't know, but at least there's like that connection with this person. And again, because of our segregated networks, right, the likelihood that someone came through a person of color is going to be low, right? And so this idea of creating the space for the consciousness of the individual within the context of the organization, again, to buffer the organization from itself, from the people, our individual tendencies that actually aren't in the best interest of the organization. Last thing I'll say about that is we say that we want to be successful, right, at everything. We're Americans, we want to succeed, right? But our behavior doesn't align with our goal. Because if we want to be successful, then we would understand, or we would not just understand, but we would be taking practical action on the fact that the more diversity you have, and not just racial diversity, but all kinds of diversity, the more diversity you have, the better products and services you have, right? The more money you're going to make, the more productive your people are. When you have a culture that not just has diversity, but that you know how to you have a culture that knows how to work through conflict, because conflict is healthy, right? That's the process that leads to all those great products and services and money that companies can have. And so if we really wanted to be successful, we would be doing those things, even in government, right? If we wanted to have the best policies, the best programs, we would be taking on those practices in government too.
So,
Do you mind if I?
yeah, no, we're just starting to get toward the end, and I have one or two topics I want to come back to, but sure.
One of my favorite quotes is complacency is one of humanity's greatest weaknesses from Rousseau. I think that really stuck with me. And I think we always have to be pushing forward self-growth. And so I'm just curious for your ambitions for 2019, on a personal level, from all ACEs level, from our city's level, from our state, from our nations, as a species, do you have any ambitions that you're kind of pushing forward to hopefully inspire others to kind of set out towards their own ambitions?
Yes. I'm glad you asked that question, because next month, February 2019, we're actually rolling out an online platform an online learning platform that allows for folks to learn more about racism and the nuance aspects of it, in different ways of looking at different aspects of it. And so it's from a very nerdy perspective, right? And in some ways, but we've created these bite-sized online modules, excuse me, that allow for folks to kind of take the baby steps towards a better and deeper understanding, but also what are some of the things that we can be doing along that journey to kind of improve ourselves and the conditions of other people. So if you're white, other white people. If you're a person of color, other people of color. One thing we didn't talk about today is the internalized oppression. And I kind of alluded to it through the story about my own family, right? And really what I was talking about is buffering my children from internalized oppression, right? And so our goal is to also have space on there for people of color. Now, I'm a Black woman, African-American woman, so for me, that's my experience. And so we're starting with Black people. And so we have a section called Black and White, right? So Black people in white, predominantly white institutions and environments, and what it means to navigate in that space while holding on to yourself, while being able to also advocate, the language with which we use to advocate, right? It's not enough to say that was racist, right? Because that's not going to get you anywhere. How do you, by having a more nuanced understanding of the issues and of yourself and how these things have impacted us, right? It gives you the freedom and space to be able to use the kind of language that points out the hypocrisy, because really that's what, it's the ignorance and the hypocrisy that plays out, right? That disproportionately impacts us. And so what is the kind of language that we can use to advocate for ourselves? How do we support each other? And so it's both a learning community and an actual community. And so we're really excited about rolling that out. It's called dynamicimpact.com. Dynamic spelled with IQ at the end, right? And an important part of that also is critical thinking. So there's the consciousness piece, but then there's also the critical thinking, right? Being able to ask ourselves those tough questions and challenge ourselves, because where the critical thinking field is now is it starts with this acknowledgement that we're flawed human beings, and that actually thinking is a skill that you actually have to learn and develop and practice, right? And it's part of that whole piece of not allowing racism to be used as a tool against you, whether you're a white person or a person of color. So we're really excited about that.
Well, that's very exciting. Just in our final moments, I want to kind of pull the frame back up and ask you a question about the trends that you see. You had an extraordinary experience talking to so many hundreds, thousands of people. And we've seen, just to talk about Boston for a second, on the one hand, we have seen Ayanna Pressley, who was the first woman of color on the Boston City Council. Then now we have 6 women of color. Ayanna Pressley is now our my congresswoman. So we
who I'll be seeing later this afternoon at her swearing-in ceremony.
Well, that's
in Roxbury.
yes. On the other hand, we had the Boston series on race, which identified so many deep strains, and I think one of the things I'm concerned about is that was raised and then kind of dropped. So how would you characterize how the community of Boston, as representative of Massachusetts and beyond, where do you see genuine progress, and where do you see that we just have to buckle down and do a lot more?
So there's not a homogenous Boston, and so there are pockets of excellence. And then there's other areas where we just are struggling. And so the pockets of excellence, I would say, are there are a lot of networks of people in Boston who are doing the hard work, white people and people of color, of what is the way that I've internalized this stuff. So for white people, you tend to internalize the superiority aspects of racism, and we internalize the inferiority parts of it, right? And so what does it mean to work through that? And there are folks like CCI in Boston, Community Change Inc., who bring together white people, have a whole network, and this is what they do, is work through, struggle through what these issues mean and what should they be doing about it, and how do they then reach other white people. You have folks like City Life, Vita Urbana, that's doing that similar work, but in the context of housing, right? How in building up the internal capacity of communities of color to be able to work on issues in their community and advocate for themselves, build the power as a group, but also in leveraging that and to do the things that they can do in their communities, but also to use it as power to push against the traditional power structures, right? And so there's lots of folks in Boston in these pockets that are doing amazing work. Where we fall down is when we talk about the broader financial, well, I shouldn't say financial, but kind of economic engines of this city, right? So, you know, some of our biggest fields has the least amount of diversity, right? And not just diversity, but even with the diversity that they do have, like where are they in the organization, right? And so that means that for our businesses and our nonprofits, especially our nonprofits who are kind of have their fingers, a lot of them in communities of color, have to be doing this work internally, all the things I mentioned before, right? That has to be happening in the organizations, because when we're not intentional about embedding equity and being conscious and thinking critically and holding ourselves accountable within our organizations and communities, then we are by default perpetuating inequities, because it is that lack of attention and intentionality that continues to let the engine do what it does. The system just churn out these inequities. So that curve that we talked about in our conversation, that most of us are in the middle of the distribution curve, just living our lives. And we're on that hamster wheel, fueling the system without realizing that that's what we're doing. And so without kind of having that intentionality, these institutions and organizations in Boston are churning out inequities, and everyone's going, we don't know why this is happening. It's like, well, people have to take ownership, and we have to see the connection that this isn't just about people of color.
Could you, something that, as we're wrapping up, I've heard you speak very persuasively and powerfully about the difference between equality and equity.
Yes.
Could you help us understand?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and it's a great way to wrap up in the sense that we oftentimes propose ideas around giving everybody the same thing, right? We just give everybody the same thing and it'll be okay. When in reality, what you're really saying is, I'm not going to pay attention to the historical context that we're not all starting from the same place. I'm going to ignore the social context. I'm going to ignore everything and just pretend like if I just give everybody the same thing, that we can all do the same things with that stuff, when it's not true, right? Because behind the scenes, right, or I should say below the surface, what we're really dealing with is a long history of policies and practices that have led to people of color and other marginalized groups not being able to access different things. And even once they access it, not being able to fully navigate in a way that they could take advantage of the access to opportunities.
Could you describe that picture of people standing on boxes?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But then on the other side, you have equity. Equity acknowledges that there's a context, that there's more behind the scenes, and that we're not just individuals that just popped out of nowhere with no background, no anything, and that we're all just on the same playing field, or level playing field. And so on the equity side, what you're really saying is, I'm going to give you what you need to succeed. I'm going to give you what you need to achieve an outcome, and we all need different things in order to be successful. And so a great visualization of that is, there's a great image that I like to use where it's on one side there's two apple trees, right? And on one side, everyone's standing on one crate, but everyone can't actually reach an apple because same size crate, right? But they can't all reach the apple because some people need more crates to reach the apple. On the other side, you have the visualization of equity. And that shows people getting the amount of crates they need to actually reach the apple. And that's what we're talking about here, focusing on being intentional, or intentionality, not what our intentions are, but being intentional, and the outcome, right?
So maybe a last question?
I kind of want to open it up to you to ask our audience or us a question. What questions are you seeking to solve that we can contribute a little energy to, that hopefully as our audience grows out there, they can contribute energy towards? Is there anything that's kind of been on your mind lately?
I would probably say this idea of what helps you in your life to be able to not just to grow and learn, but I think to also heal, right? So there's this, people talk about self-care a lot, and I have mixed feelings about it. The mixed feelings I have are how it gets framed. So it's this thing that you're supposed to do as an individual, right? And the way it gets framed is like, the perfect way to do it is like, you take like a 2-week vacation and like you go over to somewhere, I don't know, to Europe, and you like do some stuff, you spend a lot of money, and then you come back and you're magically like, okay, I had some self-care, right? And just the process for me, I can only speak for myself personally, but just the process of planning and doing all that stuff and spending all that money, like, is stressful. So I'm like, I don't know how that's self-care for me, but I think more about collective care, right? And the idea in micro self-care, right? Where it should be throughout the day. Right, and so one of my practices, and I'm always interested in learning what other people do when they're consciously trying to do these things, is to I have conversations with people who are usually invisible in our society. I have conversations with the waiters, with the waitress, with the security guard at the front desk, with the person standing at the door of the hotel, with whoever but there are hundreds and sometimes thousands of people that pass by them in the day, and they're invisible to them. Don't even know their name. They've passed by them probably thousands of times and don't even know their name, don't know anything about them. And so what I try to do is I just listen. I ask questions to them, and I just listen. And what it is another meditative practice, because when you're really listening to people, your brain is shut off. You're not all over here and all over there. Like when you're really in real conversation, you're actually completely and totally focused on that person. And for me, it's a way to address my selfish need to take care of myself and to help someone else be seen, and when they're usually not seen.
Thank you for sharing.
Well, I resonate with that because when I was in politics, it gave me an opportunity to ask a lot of people about their lives, and it really enriched me every time. And so I hope that you'll keep an eye on what we're doing here on this show, and that you will feel free to advise us and suggest things and help us expand the network of conversation.
You have my cell phone. You can text me anytime.
Okay, all right, yes. And we just very much want to thank you. We may have a few other questions about resources that we could use. And we hope that this show will be an instrument to inspire people and to help people gain confidence and to be part of that larger process of healing that I think that we very much need. So thank you so much for being with us
it's my
today,
pleasure.
Dr. Martin. And
Thank you, Dr. Martin.
we look forward to seeing you again.
I think we all have a responsibility to repair the world. You know, we're lucky to be here in the Lighthouse space at CIC, whose mission is to fix the world through innovation. Definitely want to shout out to my personal appreciation, our team's appreciation for being here, for facilitating this type of conversation, because we think it's necessary. We want to go out there and make an impact with conversation so we can articulate where we want to go and then work backwards to get there as a team, as a species, as humanity. But we want to hear from you. We want to make sure that this show, this program is a resource for you to continue to go out there and make an impact. So we really appreciate you for listening, watching, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.